My name is Ned, a young lady from Nigeria. Listen as I share my story. A life I would never wish for again.
I never imagined my life would take the turn it did. Growing up, I had dreams like every other child. Big, colorful dreams that I clung to on long, hungry nights. I wanted to be a teacher, a mother, and a woman who could proudly care for her family. In my young, innocent mind, the world was full of endless possibilities, and nothing seemed impossible. But dreams have a cruel way of being crushed under the weight of reality. I was born into a family that had little but each other. My father left when I was barely old enough to remember his face, leaving my mother to shoulder the heavy burden of raising 4 children on her own. We lived in a one-room shack in the heart of a slum, with peeling walls that leaked during the rainy season and a roof patched with old tarpaulin sheets. Every day was a struggle. Food was scarce, and eating twice a day was a luxury we could rarely afford. My siblings and I would take turns eating to make sure no one starved completely. The nights were the hardest. The hunger gnawed at our insides, and the sound of my mother crying herself to sleep became an all too familiar lullaby. I was the eldest child, and with that position came a sense of responsibility that felt far too heavy for my young shoulders. I knew my mother was doing everything she could, working odd jobs that barely paid enough to cover rent, let alone feed us all. Watching her break down time and time again, I promised myself I would do whatever it took to help her and my siblings. School was my escape, the one place where I felt like I could dream without limits. I loved learning, especially literature, and I excelled in my classes despite the challenges at home. My teachers often praised my potential, calling me a bright light in a dark room. They believed I could achieve great things, and for a while, so did I. But reality soon caught up with me. When I reached senior secondary school 2, SS2, the financial strain on our family became unbearable. My mother sat me down one evening, her face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. "Ezinne," she began, her voice trembling, "I can't do this anymore. Your siblings need to eat, and we're behind on rent. I need you to help me." I knew what she was asking. Dropping out of school felt like cutting off a piece of my soul, but I couldn't let my family suffer. So with tears in my eyes and a heavy heart, I packed away my school books and set out to find work. Menial jobs became my new normal. I washed clothes for neighbors who paid me little more than pocket change. I sold pure water in traffic, dodging impatient drivers and enduring the scorching sun. Some days, I earned just enough to buy a loaf of bread. Other days, I went home empty-handed. Despite my best efforts, it was never enough. The bills kept piling up, and the hunger in my siblings' eyes grew more desperate. I felt like I was drowning, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't keep my family afloat. Then Grace came into my life. Grace was a girl from my neighborhood, someone I'd known since childhood. She had always been bold and outspoken, with a confidence that made people notice her. When she visited me one evening, I hardly recognized her. She was dressed in a shiny, form-fitting dress, her face perfectly made up, and she carried herself with a poise I envied. "Ezinne," she said, looking around my cramped room with a mix of pity and curiosity, "why are you suffering like this?" Her words stung because they held a truth I couldn't deny. "There's a better way to make money," she continued, her voice low and persuasive. I hesitated. "What kind of work are you talking about?" Grace smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Don't worry about that. Just follow me one night, and I promise you'll thank me later." Her offer lingered in my mind long after she left. At first, I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself that I could find another way to help my family. But as the days turned into weeks and our situation grew more desperate, her words echoed louder and louder. One night, as I lay awake listening to my siblings' stomachs growling in their sleep, I made a decision that would change my life forever. "I'll go," I told myself. Just once. I had no idea what I was stepping into. The night I decided to follow Grace felt surreal, as though I were stepping into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She arrived at our house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, her appearance as dazzling as ever. Dressed in a red gown that shimmered under the faint glow of streetlights, she exuded a confidence I couldn't begin to mimic. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice casual, as though we were heading out for a simple errand. I nodded hesitantly, clutching the only decent dress I owned, a hand-me-down from a distant relative. It was plain and slightly oversized, but it would have to do. Grace looked me up and down, her lips curving into a smirk. "We'll work on your wardrobe later," she said with a chuckle. "But for now, this will do." As we walked through the narrow, dimly lit streets of our neighborhood, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and anticipation. My heart raced with every step, and my palms were slick with sweat. I had no idea where we were going or what awaited me, but desperation kept me moving forward. We eventually arrived at a bustling club on the outskirts of town. The building was alive with neon lights, and the thumping bass of the music could be heard from outside. The air smelled of alcohol and cigarettes, a sharp contrast to the musty scent of my daily life. Grace led me inside, her demeanor cool and collected. I tried to mirror her confidence, but my wide eyes and stiff posture gave away my nervousness. The interior of the club was overwhelming. The lights were colorful and dizzying, casting strange shadows on the walls. Men and women danced closely on the crowded floor, their movements uninhibited and carefree. Waitresses in revealing outfits weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of drinks with practiced ease. Grace guided me to a corner where a group of men sat, their eyes scanning the room like predators searching for prey. She introduced me as new to the game, her tone casual, as though this were a normal conversation. One of the men, a tall, dark-skinned man with a gold chain around his neck, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on me. "How much for the night?" he asked, his voice deep and laced with authority. Before I could process his words, Grace answered for me. "She's special," she said with a sly smile. "You'll have to pay extra." The man smirked, pulling a wad of cash from his pocket. He handed it to Grace, who slipped it into her purse without hesitation. Then he turned to me, extending his hand. "Let's go," he said simply. My stomach churned as I followed him out of the club. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more panicked than the last. What am I doing? How did I get here? Can I back out now? But it was too late. We entered a small, dimly lit room in a nearby hotel. The man's demeanor was cold and transactional, his words few and direct. As the reality of the situation dawned on me, I felt an overwhelming wave of fear and shame. The next moments were a blur of pain and humiliation. I cried silently, unable to look at him or at myself. When it was over, I felt empty, like a part of me had been ripped away and replaced with a hollow ache. I returned home that night feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The money Grace handed me felt heavy in my hands, a physical representation of the price I had paid. I gave most of it to my mother, who looked at me with tears of gratitude. "Ezinne, you're a blessing," she said, her voice trembling. "This will help us so much." Her words broke me. She didn't know where the money had come from, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was a one-time thing. But the money was tempting, and our family's situation was still dire. Grace visited me often, her tone persuasive and reassuring. "You did well," she said, her smile warm. "It gets easier, I promise." I wasn't sure if I believed her, but the thought of going back to selling pure water in traffic or washing clothes for pennies made my stomach turn. The decision to go out again wasn't made consciously. It was as though I was being swept along by an invisible current, too weak to resist. The second night was no easier than the first, nor was the third or fourth. Each time I told myself it was temporary, that I was doing this for my family. But deep down, I knew I was losing pieces of myself with every encounter. Grace became my mentor in this new life, teaching me how to carry myself with confidence, how to speak to men in a way that made them open their wallets without question. She introduced me to other girls in the business, some of whom had been doing it for years. They all had stories of poverty, of betrayal, of dreams crushed under the weight of circumstance. "We're survivors," Grace would say, raising her glass in a toast. This life isn't for the weak. But I didn't feel strong. I felt trapped. One night, as I sat alone in my room counting the money I had earned, I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, a hollow-eyed girl who barely resembled the person I used to be. Is this who I am now? I wondered, the question echoing in my mind. But I pushed the thought aside. Survival didn't leave room for self-reflection. The money was good, better than anything I had ever imagined. For the first time, my siblings had proper clothes and enough to eat. I even managed to send them back to school, a small victory that I clung to in my darkest moments. My mother continued to pray for me, her gratitude unwavering. God will bless you for all you're doing for this family, she would say, her voice full of hope. I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The life I had stepped into was a double-edged sword. It brought comfort and relief to my family, but it was slowly destroying me from the inside out. I tried to focus on the good, the food on our table, the roof over our heads, but the shame never left me. Deep down, I knew this path wouldn't lead anywhere good, but I didn't know how to stop, and so I continued, telling myself that I had no other choice. As time passed, I began to settle into the life I had chosen. The initial shock and shame of my first night in the club dulled over time, replaced by a strange sense of acceptance. It wasn't that I enjoyed what I did. I don't think I ever truly could. But the money made the pain feel worthwhile, or so I told myself. My family's life began to change. The hunger that once haunted our nights became a distant memory, replaced by the aroma of steaming pots of food and fresh bread. My siblings, once clad in torn and faded clothes, now wore neat uniforms to school, their faces glowing with pride. Even my mother, whose weary eyes once reflected endless worry, seemed lighter, her smile more frequent. But while the people around me thrived, I felt myself slipping deeper into a darkness I couldn't quite explain. Grace had become my constant companion. She was the one who taught me the unspoken rules of the game, the art of attracting customers, the importance of looking confident, and the necessity of always carrying a sharp wit to navigate dangerous situations. Ezinne, she would say, her tone firm yet almost sisterly, you're beautiful, but beauty alone won't save you in this life. Men respect confidence. Make them feel like they need you, not the other way around. I listened to her advice like a student hanging on her teacher's every word. Grace was everything I wasn't, bold, carefree, and seemingly unbothered by the life she lived. I envied her ability to laugh and dance without a care in the world, while I spent my nights questioning my choices and my mornings hiding the tears that stained my pillow. One evening, as we prepared to head out, she brought me a new dress. It was a sleek, black number that hugged my figure in a way that made me uncomfortable. You need to stop looking like you borrowed your clothes from your grandmother, she teased, tossing the dress onto my lap. Try this on. I hesitated, running my fingers over the silky fabric. Grace, I don't think this is me. She rolled her eyes. That's the point. You're not you tonight. You're whoever they need you to be. Now, get dressed. Reluctantly, I put on the dress. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back. The girl in the reflection was polished and poised, her hair styled to perfection and her makeup expertly applied. Now that's better, Grace said with a satisfied nod. But I felt like an imposter, wearing a mask that could crack at any moment. The club had become my second home, though I often wished it were anything but. The loud music, the flashing lights, the smell of sweat and alcohol, it all felt suffocating. Yet I returned night after night because the money was too good to ignore. My routine became predictable. I would arrive with grace, plaster on a confident smile, and wait for the men to approach. Some nights were easier than others. A polite customer might simply want company and conversation. Other nights were harder. The men rough and demanding, their words cutting deeper than any physical pain. To cope, I started drinking. It began innocently enough. A glass of wine here, a cocktail there, The alcohol dulled the edges of my reality, making it easier to endure the nights. But as the demands of the job grew harsher, my drinking escalated. Grace noticed my growing reliance on alcohol and didn't discourage it. "If it helps, she said with a shrug. "This life isn't for the weak, Ezinne. Do whatever you need to survive." Her words gave me permission to numb myself further. Soon I was no longer just drinking. I began experimenting with other substances. It started with weed, a joint passed casually among friends at an after-party. Then came the harder drugs, pills and powders that promised to take me far away from the pain, if only for a little while. Each time I told myself it was just to get through the night. But the nights turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and before I knew it, I couldn't face my reality without some kind of escape. The money I made during this time was more than I had ever dreamed of. I upgraded my family's living situation, moving us out of the slum and into a modest 2-bedroom apartment. My siblings no longer had to walk barefoot to school, and my mother's health improved with proper food and medication. To the outside world, I looked like a success story. People in our old neighborhood whispered about me, some with admiration, others with envy. "She must have found a big job in the city," I overheard one woman say to another. "Or a rich man," her companion replied with a knowing smirk. I let them believe whatever they wanted. The truth was too ugly to share. At home, my mother continued to shower me with praise. "Ezinne, you're a blessing," she would say, her voice filled with emotion. "Your father may have abandoned us, but God gave us you." Her words felt like knives in my chest. She didn't know that her blessing came at the cost of my soul. Despite the facade of success, I couldn't shake the emptiness that gnawed at me. The more money I made, the less it seemed to matter. The nice clothes, the fancy hairdos, the admiration from strangers, none of it filled the void inside me. One night, as I sat alone in my room counting the day's earnings, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. The stacks of cash on my bed seemed meaningless, their value diminished by the cost I had paid to earn them. Is this what my life has become? I thought, the question haunting me. But no matter how much I hated myself, I couldn't bring myself to stop. The money wasn't just for me, it was for my family. How could I let them go back to the life we had left behind? So I pushed the thoughts aside, telling myself that this was the sacrifice I had to make. Grace, ever the life of the party, didn't seem to share my struggles. She thrived in the chaos, her laughter filling the air wherever she went. "Why are you always so serious, Ezinne?" she asked one night as we sat in the club. "Lighten up. You're young, beautiful, and making more money than most people can dream of. This is your time to enjoy life." But I didn't feel like I was enjoying anything. I felt like I was surviving, barely holding myself together while everything inside me crumbled. The illusion of comfort that my new life provided was just that, an illusion. Beneath the surface, I was broken, lost, and desperately searching for a way out. But I didn't know how to escape, and so I stayed. The nights grew longer, and the days became a haze of exhaustion and emptiness. My life had turned into a cycle I couldn't escape. By day, I played the role of the dutiful daughter, handing my mother money and watching her face light up with gratitude. By night, I transformed into someone else entirely, a woman I didn't recognize, living a life I never dreamed for myself. Grace continued to guide me, her confidence as unwavering as ever, but even she couldn't hide the cracks in her own facade. I began to notice the little things, how she downed her drinks faster than before, how her laughter sometimes felt forced, and how she avoided answering certain questions about her own life. Despite her bravado, I suspected she was as trapped as I was. One night, as we prepared to head out, I noticed a change in Grace's demeanor. She seemed quieter, her usual energy subdued. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She glanced at me, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I didn't press her. Grace wasn't the type to share her vulnerabilities, and I wasn't in a position to pry. But her silence lingered in my mind as we made our way to the club. The club was as chaotic as ever, the air heavy with the scent of alcohol and cigarette smoke. The flashing lights and pounding music created a disorienting atmosphere, one that had become both familiar and suffocating. Grace disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, leaving me to navigate the night on my own. I found a spot at the bar and ordered a drink, hoping to dull the growing sense of unease that had settled in my chest. As I sipped my cocktail, a man approached me. He was older, with a commanding presence and a voice that demanded attention. "You're new here," he said, his eyes scanning me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I forced a smile, trying to keep my composure. "Not that new," I replied, my tone light. He chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Well, you've caught my attention," he said. "Let's talk business." That night was one of the hardest I had ever endured. The man was rough and demanding, his words cutting and his actions careless. By the time it was over, I felt broken, my body aching and my spirit crushed. When I returned home, I collapsed onto my bed, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I knew no one would understand. My mother and siblings were asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the hell I was living. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. How did my life come to this? How can I keep going? But even as I questioned my choices, I knew I couldn't stop. The money was too important. My family relied on me, and I couldn't bear the thought of letting them down. In the weeks that followed, I fell deeper into my vices. The alcohol that once took the edge off my nights became a crutch I couldn't function without. I drank before heading to the club, during my time there, and even after I returned home. The buzz helped me forget, if only temporarily, the shame and pain that had become my constant companions. But alcohol wasn't enough. Grace introduced me to other substances, each one promising an escape more potent than the last. "You'll feel better," she assured me as she handed me a small rolled joint. "It helps you relax." Desperate for relief, I took it without hesitation. The first drag burned my throat, but the sensation that followed was euphoric. For the first time in what felt like forever, my mind was quiet. The weight of my reality momentarily lifted. From that moment on, I began chasing that feeling. Grace and I grew closer during this time, bonded by our shared experiences and mutual reliance on substances to get through the nights. We became a team, looking out for each other in the chaotic world we inhabited. But even Grace had her limits. One night, as we sat in her small apartment, she confided in me in a way she never had before. "This life," she began, her voice low, "it takes everything from you. Your dignity, your dreams, even your soul. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." Her words surprised me. Grace had always seemed so sure of herself, so unbothered by the choices she had made. Hearing her admit to doubt made me realize just how fragile we both were. "Do you think we'll ever get out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a long sip of her drink, her gaze distant. "Maybe," she said finally, "but it won't be easy, and not everyone makes it." Her words hung in the air, a sobering reminder of the path we were on. The turning point came one fateful night.